Hi, I'm Jessica, and my supposedly dead father walked into my wedding reception like he owned the place. For 25 years, my mother told me he died in Afghanistan when I was 7 years old. She had the folded flag, the condolence letters, even a headstone I visited every Memorial Day. But there he was, standing in the back of the Riverside Country Club ballroom, wearing his dress blues with ribbons I'd never seen before, watching me dance with my new husband like he'd been invited all along. My mother's face went white as fresh snow when she saw him. And that's when I knew every tear I'd cried, every Father's Day I'd spent at a grave, every moment I'd wished he could walk me down the aisle was built on a lie so deep it had roots in places I'd never thought to dig. She thought I'd never find out, thought she could control the narrative forever, thought she had buried the truth so deep that even a military investigation couldn't reach it. But she forgot one thing. My father was Special Forces, and Special Forces soldiers don't stay buried when they're still breathing. Before we begin, let me ask you something that's been burning in my chest since that night. Have you ever discovered that your entire life story was a carefully constructed lie? Have you ever realized that the person you trusted most in the world stole decades from you, from someone you loved, just because they could? Drop your story in the comments below because I've learned that betrayal runs deeper than we ever imagine. And sometimes the people who claim to protect us are the ones we need protection from. I read every single comment, and I promise you, if you've lived through deception this deep, you'll understand why what happened next had to happen. The reception was everything I dreamed of since I was a little girl, planning weddings for my dolls in the attic of our old house on Maple Street. White roses and baby's breath draped every table, soft jazz played from speakers hidden among the ivy-covered columns, and fairy lights twinkled like captured stars against the cathedral ceiling. My dress was my grandmother's, altered to fit but still carrying the scent of her lavender sachets, and I felt beautiful, complete, like every broken piece of my childhood had finally been put back together. David looked at me like I was the only woman who'd ever existed, his hand steady and warm on my waist as we swayed to our song. At Last by Etta James, the same song my mother claimed my father used to hum when he thought no one was listening. I'd chosen that song specifically because it felt like honoring him, like having him there in the only way I thought possible. The whole day had been about carrying his memory forward, about starting my new life with the lessons I'd learned from losing him so young. In my bouquet, I'd wrapped a small photo of him in his army fatigues, the only picture my mother had ever shown me, and I'd placed a single white rose on the empty chair we'd reserved for him at the head table. The program even had a dedication. In loving memory of Sergeant Michael Harrison, who taught his daughter to be brave, even though he couldn't stay to see her grow up. But then the music seemed to fade. Conversations dropped to whispers, and I felt a shift in the room like the air pressure had changed before a storm. David's hand tightened on mine, and I followed his stunned gaze toward the back of the room where the late arrivals usually slipped in quietly. Instead of a latecomer in wedding attire, there stood a man in full military dress uniform, his posture straight as a flagpole, his silver hair cut in a regulation fade that looked fresh from the barber. His chest was decorated with ribbons and medals that caught the light like small pieces of stained glass, and his eyes, steel blue and intense, were scanning the room with the methodical precision of someone trained to assess every detail of every situation. Those eyes landed on me, and my breath caught in my throat because I knew them. I'd seen them every morning in my own reflection. The same unusual shade of blue-gray that everyone always commented on, the same slightly hooded shape that made me look serious even when I was laughing. But it wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. My father was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, or at least that's what the headstone in our local cemetery claimed. I'd left flowers there just 2 weeks ago, telling him about the wedding, about David, about how I wished he could be there to walk me down the aisle. The man in uniform took a step forward, then another, and the crowd began to part like the Red Sea, guests turning to look at him. Then at me, then at my mother, who had gone completely rigid beside the cake table. Her champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp and final in the sudden silence. She was staring at him like she'd seen a ghost, which, according to everything I'd been told my entire life, she had. My new husband whispered, Jessica, who is that? But I couldn't answer because my voice had disappeared, somewhere between shock and recognition. The man was older than I'd expected. Lines around those familiar eyes that spoke of years lived in places my mother had never mentioned, but his face was the same one from the single photograph I'd treasured my whole life. Older, weathered, marked by time and experiences I couldn't imagine, but unmistakably, impossibly, definitely my father. He walked toward me with the measured gait of someone accustomed to ceremony, each step deliberate and proud, and I noticed other details that my stunned brain was trying to process. The ribbons on his chest included ones I'd studied in military museums, decorations for valor, for service in multiple theaters, for missions that extended far beyond the Afghanistan deployment that had supposedly killed him. His uniform fit him perfectly, not like something pulled from storage, but like something he wore regularly, recently, professionally. When he stopped about 10 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of emotion held carefully in check, he spoke in a voice that was exactly like the one I'd imagined in my dreams. Jessica Marie Harrison. Not a question, a statement. My full name spoken like a prayer, like something he'd practiced saying, like words he'd been waiting 25 years to speak again. I looked over at my mother, desperate for an explanation, for her to tell me this was some kind of mistake, some cosmic coincidence, anything that would make sense of what was happening. Instead, I saw guilt written across her face in lines so deep they looked like they'd been carved there with a knife. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak, but no words came out, just the sound of someone drowning in their own deception. My father, because somehow I knew with absolute certainty that's who this was, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. I've been writing to you for 25 years, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion I could see gathering in his eyes. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone I missed, your mother made sure you never got a single letter. The room had gone completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the highway beyond the country club grounds. 300 wedding guests were witnessing something that felt too private, too raw for an audience, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at this man who was supposed to be dead, holding an envelope that proved 25 years of correspondence I'd never known existed. I know this isn't how you plan to spend your wedding day, he continued, glancing briefly at David, who was standing beside me like a statue, still holding my hand, but clearly unsure whether to protect me from this stranger or help me toward him. I know this is probably the worst timing in the world, and I know you have every right to hate me for not coming forward sooner. But I couldn't let you start your married life without knowing the truth about why I disappeared. And I couldn't let that woman, he nodded toward my mother without looking at her, continue to control the narrative about what happened to us. My mother finally found her voice, high and shrill with panic. Michael, you promised. You gave me your word. This isn't fair to her. Not today. Not like this. But her words rang hollow, desperate, like someone trying to maintain control of a situation that had already spun completely beyond their reach. My father's expression hardened when he looked at her. 25 years of anger and loss concentrated into a look that could have melted steel. Fair? He said quietly, but his voice carried across the silent room like he was addressing troops. Was it fair to tell our daughter I was dead? Was it fair to move across the country and change your name so I could never find you? Was it fair to let her grow up thinking her father abandoned her by dying when he was doing everything in his power to come home to her? The words hit me like physical blows. Each revelation another piece of a puzzle I'd never known was incomplete. Changed names? Moved across the country? I'd always been Jessica Harrison. We'd always lived in North Carolina. My mother had always been Sarah Harrison. Except apparently none of that was true. The silence in the ballroom stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. My bouquet trembled in my hands, white roses and baby's breath suddenly feeling heavy as stones. David's grip on my other hand was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. But even that felt distant, like I was watching this scene unfold from somewhere far above the crystal chandeliers. 300 guests sat frozen in their chairs, champagne glasses halfway to lips, conversations abandoned mid sentence, all eyes ping ponging between the man in dress blues and my mother, who looked like she might collapse at any moment. I needed to hear from you, from people who understand what it feels like when your foundation crumbles. Have you ever had a moment when everything you believed about your life turned out to be fiction? When the person who raised you, who tucked you in at night and kissed your scraped knees, turned out to be the architect of your deepest pain? Because standing there in my grandmother's wedding dress, holding a bouquet that was supposed to honor a dead father who apparently wasn't dead, I realized I was about to learn things that would change every memory I'd ever treasured. Drop your story in the comments if you've lived through deception that ran so deep it rewrote your entire childhood. I promise I read every single one, because what happened next taught me that sometimes the people we love most are capable of the cruelest betrayals. My father stepped closer, and I caught the scent of his cologne, something clean and masculine that felt achingly familiar, even though I couldn't place where I'd smelled it before. Maybe in dreams, maybe in the phantom memories that sometimes surface when you're missing someone so desperately that your mind creates what it needs to survive. His uniform was immaculate, every ribbon precisely placed, every crease sharp enough to cut glass, but it was his hands that broke my heart. They were shaking now, barely perceptibly, the way hands shake when someone is trying very hard to maintain control of emotions that are too big for any human container. Jessica, he said again, and this time my name sounded like a prayer he'd been practicing for decades. I know you probably have a million questions, and I know this is the worst possible timing, but I couldn't let another day pass without you knowing that I never stopped looking for you. Not for one single day in 25 years. My mother moved then, stepping forward with the jerky, unnatural gait of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. Michael, please, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying across the vast ballroom. Not here. Not in front of everyone. This isn't how we should do this. How we should do this? His voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath it now. The kind of controlled anger that comes from years of military training and decades of injustice. Sarah, there is no we anymore. There hasn't been a we since you disappeared with my daughter. And let me believe you were both dead for 3 years until I hired a private investigator who told me you'd changed your names and moved to North Carolina. The words hit the crowd like a physical wave. I heard my Aunt Linda gasp from table 6, heard David's mother whisper, "Oh my God," from somewhere behind me, heard the soft clink of silverware being set down as people realized they were witnessing something that belonged in a courtroom or a therapist's office, not at a wedding reception. But I couldn't process their reactions because my brain was stuck on what my father had just said. Changed our names? I repeated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. What do you mean we changed our names? I've always been Jessica Harrison. We've always been Harrisons. My father's expression softened when he looked at me, the anger he directed at my mother replaced by something infinitely tender and heartbreakingly sad. Your name was Jessica Marie Donovan when you were born, sweetheart. You lived in Seattle until you were 7 years old, in a blue house with a tire swing in the backyard that I built for you the summer before I deployed. You had a dog named Soldier, a golden retriever who used to sleep at the foot of your bed, even though your mother said he was too big to be a house dog. The memories hit me like a tsunami. Flashes of images I'd always dismissed as childhood dreams or fantasies suddenly snapping into focus with crystalline clarity. A blue house with white shutters and a red front door. A tire swing that hung from an enormous oak tree, spinning me in circles until I was dizzy with laughter. A golden dog with soft ears and gentle eyes who would let me dress him up in my doll clothes and never complained when I used him as a pillow during Saturday morning cartoons. Soldier, I whispered, and the name felt like coming home. He had a white patch on his chest shaped like a star. You remember? My father's voice cracked for the first time, and I saw tears gathering in those steel blue eyes that were so much like my own. I was so afraid you wouldn't remember anything. You were so young when she took you away. David squeezed my hand tighter, and I realized I was swaying on my feet like someone who'd had too much champagne. Except I'd barely touched my glass all evening. The room felt like it was tilting, like someone had picked up the country club and given it a gentle shake, rearranging all the furniture of my reality. My mother was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in black rivulets. But they weren't tears of joy at this miraculous reunion. They were tears of someone whose carefully constructed lies were being demolished brick by brick in front of an audience of 300 people. Why? The word came out of me like a sob, directed at my mother, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Why would you tell me he was dead? Why would you let me grow up thinking my father abandoned me by dying in some foreign country when he was alive and looking for me? My mother opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for air. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin and defensive, the tone of someone who'd spent years perfecting justifications for the unjustifiable. You don't understand, Jessica. It was complicated. The situation was dangerous. I had to protect you. Protect me? I felt my voice rising, felt years of grief and loss and Father's Day sadness crystallizing into anger that burned hot and clean in my chest. Protect me from what? From having a father who loved me? From growing up knowing where I came from? From having someone walk me down the aisle today instead of having to walk alone? My father stepped closer again, close enough now that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow that I'd inherited, the way his jaw clenched when he was trying not to lose his temper. All features I recognized from my own mirror, all evidence of a genetic connection my mother had tried to erase with paperwork and geographical distance. The danger she's talking about, he said quietly, was the danger that I might get custody of you when I came back from deployment. The danger that a court might decide that a father who'd served his country honorably and came home without a scratch was more fit to raise his daughter than a mother who'd been having an affair with her boss while her husband was overseas. The ballroom collectively held its breath. I felt David stiffen beside me, felt the weight of 300 people processing this new layer of betrayal, but all I could focus on was my mother's face, as the truth my father was telling landed like bombs across her carefully constructed facade. Her mouth opened in a silent O of shock, but she didn't deny it. She didn't say he was lying or mistaken or confused. She just stood there looking guilty as sin while her daughter's wedding reception turned into the courtroom she'd spent 25 years avoiding. That's why you told me he was dead, I said, and it wasn't a question anymore. Because it was easier than explaining why you were leaving him. Because dead heroes don't fight for custody or ask uncomfortable questions about why their wives moved across the country without leaving a forwarding address. The envelope in my father's hand suddenly seemed to glow with significance. 25 years of letters I'd never received, 25 years of birthday cards and Christmas wishes and bedtime stories written from a distance, all because my mother had decided that her comfort was more important than my right to know my father. I thought about all the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, missing a man I thought was buried in Arlington Cemetery, all the Father's Day projects I'd skipped at school because they hurt too much, all the times I'd wondered if I'd inherited his smile or his laugh or his stubborn streak and had no way to find out. I want to read them, I said, my voice steadier now, fed by a growing anger that felt clean and righteous and long overdue. I want to read every single letter you wrote to me. My father's face lit up with something that might have been hope, might have been relief, might have been the first genuine joy he'd felt in decades. There are boxes of them, he said softly. In my apartment in Virginia, I have a whole room dedicated to you, Jessica. Pictures I found of you from school websites, newspaper clippings when you made the honor roll, copies of college applications I helped you fill out even though you never knew I was there. The fairy lights that had seemed so magical an hour ago now felt harsh and exposing, casting strange shadows across my father's weathered face as he stood there holding 25 years of stolen correspondence. My wedding dress suddenly felt too tight, the bodice constricting my breathing as if the very fabric was rejecting this new reality. David's hand in mine had gone from comforting to anchor-like, the only thing preventing me from floating away into the surreal nightmare my perfect day had become. My mother was backing toward the French doors that led to the terrace, her movements small and calculated, like someone trying to escape a crime scene without drawing attention. But there was nowhere to run now. Not with 300 witnesses and a daughter who was finally old enough to demand answers. Her carefully styled hair was coming loose from its chignon, silver strands framing a face that looked like it had aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Pictures, I repeated, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the cavernous ballroom. What kind of pictures? My father reached into his other jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, the kind servicemen carry, creased and softened by years of handling. He opened it carefully as if the contents were made of spun glass, and I caught a glimpse of photographs tucked behind clear plastic sleeves. Your seventh grade school picture, he said, tilting the wallet so I could see. You were wearing a blue dress with white flowers, and you'd lost your front tooth the week before picture day. I found it on the Riverside Middle School website when they posted their honor roll. The breath left my lungs in a rush. I remembered that picture, remembered how mortified I'd been about the missing tooth, how my mother had assured me it looked cute and made me look younger. But what I remembered most was standing in line with all the other kids, watching them smooth down their hair and adjust their clothes while thinking about how none of their fathers would ever see these pictures because their fathers weren't buried in military cemeteries. You were there, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. You were watching me grow up. From a distance, he confirmed, his voice thick with 25 years of suppressed emotion. I hired investigators every few years when the trail went cold. I attended your high school graduation from the back of the auditorium, wore a baseball cap and sunglasses so your mother wouldn't spot me. I was there when you got your diploma, Jessica. I was there when you walked across that stage, and I was so proud I thought my chest might explode. The room started to spin again, and I felt David's arm slide around my waist, steadying me against his solid warmth. My high school graduation had been one of the hardest days of my life. Watching all my classmates hug their fathers after the ceremony, while I stood alone with my mother, both of us pretending we didn't notice the empty space where another person should have been. I'd spent that entire day wondering what my father would have thought of my valedictorian speech, whether he would have been proud of my acceptance to Duke University, whether he would have cried when they called my name. You heard my speech, I said, and it wasn't a question because suddenly I was remembering a moment I'd dismissed at the time. After the ceremony, as we were leaving the auditorium, I'd felt someone watching me with an intensity that made me turn around. I'd seen a man in a baseball cap and aviator sunglasses standing by the back exit, completely still while everyone else moved around him like water around a stone. When our eyes met across that crowded space, something had flickered in my chest, some recognition I couldn't name. But then my mother had called my name, and when I'd looked back, he was gone. It was you, I breathed. You were wearing a red polo shirt and khaki pants, and you had a small American flag pin on your hat. My father's composure cracked completely then, and tears spilled over his lower lashes, tracking down cheeks that looked like they hadn't seen many tears in recent years. You saw me, he said wonderfully, like I'd just given him the most precious gift imaginable. I was so careful to stay hidden, but you looked right at me. I've wondered for 8 years if you really saw me or if it was just a coincidence. I felt something, I admitted, my own voice breaking now. I felt like someone was calling my name, but not out loud, like someone was sending me love from across a crowded room. My mother made a sound then, something between a sob and a growl, and when I looked at her, her face was twisted with an emotion I'd never seen before. Not guilt, not sadness, but something uglier and more possessive. This is exactly why I had to keep you away from him, she said, her voice rising above the stunned silence of our guests. Look how he's manipulating you, Jessica. Look how he's turning you against me with all these romantic stories about watching you from afar. Manipulating me. The anger that had been building in my chest suddenly blazed into something white hot and dangerous. He's telling me the truth for the first time in my life. You're the one who's been manipulating me for 25 years. You don't understand what he was like before he deployed, my mother continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was trying to convince me of something I didn't want to believe. He was controlling, possessive. He wanted to dictate every aspect of our lives. When he left for Afghanistan, I finally had room to breathe. My father's jaw tightened, and I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides before he deliberately relaxed them. I wanted to know where my wife and daughter were when I was halfway around the world getting shot at, he said quietly. I wanted to Skype with Jessica before bedtime and help with her homework over video calls. I wanted to be part of our family even when I couldn't be physically present. That's not controlling, Sarah. That's being a father and a husband. You checked our bank account obsessively, my mother shot back. You wanted to know every penny I spent, every place I went. Because you were spending our savings on things we hadn't discussed while I was earning combat pay in a war zone, my father replied, his voice still level but with an edge that spoke of arguments I'd never heard, conflicts that had shaped my childhood in ways I'd never understood. Because I came home on leave once and found credit card bills for a jewelry store I'd never heard of and restaurant charges that happened when you told me you were home with Jessica. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture I'd never been allowed to see. My mother hadn't just been unfaithful, she'd been living a double life, spending money they didn't have on a relationship that violated everything my father had thought he was fighting to protect. And when he'd started asking questions, when he'd tried to understand why his family felt like strangers when he called from overseas, she decided it was easier to make him disappear than to face the consequences of her choices. That's why you moved us while he was deployed, I said, understanding that it was flooding through me like ice water. You didn't wait for him to come home, because you knew he'd figure out what you'd been doing. My mother's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the broken woman she probably was underneath all the lies and justifications. I was lonely, she whispered. He was gone for months at a time, and I was raising you alone, and Richard was there, and he understood what I was going through. Richard, my father repeated, and the name sounded like poison in his mouth. Your boss, the married man with 3 kids of his own who promised you he'd leave his wife but never did. The ballroom was so quiet now that I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the soft whisper of fabric as guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, could hear the distant sound of traffic beyond the country club's manicured grounds. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, surrounded by everyone I loved, celebrating the beginning of my future with David. Instead, it had become an excavation of my past, a brutal archaeology of lies that had shaped every day of my existence. Where is he now? I asked my mother, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Richard, the man you chose over my father, the man you thought was worth destroying our family for. My mother's silence stretched so long that I thought she might not answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. He went back to his wife 6 months after we moved to North Carolina. Said the guilt was eating him alive, said he couldn't break up his real family for what we had. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. She'd blown up our family for a man who'd ultimately chosen his own family over her, leaving her alone to raise a daughter who spent every day mourning a father who was alive and searching for her. 25 years of single motherhood, 25 years of my questions about my father, 25 years of maintaining an elaborate fiction about his death. All for a relationship that had lasted 6 months after she'd gotten what she thought she wanted. So you were alone anyway, I said, and it wasn't a question. You gave up everything, and you still ended up alone. My father stepped closer then, close enough that I could see the pain in his eyes wasn't just about losing me, but about understanding how completely his wife had destroyed their family for something that hadn't even been real. I would have forgiven you, he told my mother, his voice soft, but carrying clearly across the silent room. If you'd told me the truth when I came home, if you'd asked for marriage counseling or a divorce, I would have been hurt, but I would have forgiven you. We could have worked out custody arrangements that put Jessica first. She didn't have to lose her father because you made a mistake. The weight of my father's words settled over the ballroom like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its implications. My mother stood frozen near the terrace doors, her face a mask of devastation that I'd never seen before, not even when she'd told me about my father's supposed death all those years ago. The elaborate floral centerpieces on each table suddenly looked garish and inappropriate, white roses and gold ribbons mocking the darkness that was unfolding in what should have been a celebration of love and new beginnings. David's grip on my hand had tightened to the point of pain, but I barely noticed because every nerve in my body was focused on processing the magnitude of what had been stolen from me. Not just a father, but an entire relationship, an entire version of myself that had been shaped by his presence instead of his absence. I thought about all the decisions I'd made over the years, all the ways I'd tried to fill the father shaped hole in my life, all the men I'd dated who reminded me of the fantasy father I'd constructed from one photograph and my mother's carefully edited stories. Forgiveness, I repeated, tasting the word like something foreign and bitter. You would have forgiven her for destroying our family, but she chose to let me think you were dead instead of facing the possibility that you might be angry with her. My father's expression softened as he looked at me, and I saw something in his face that I'd been searching for my entire life without knowing it. Unconditional love. The kind of love that survives decades of separation and unanswered letters and missed milestones. The kind of love that shows up at your wedding, uninvited because the alternative is letting you start your married life believing a lie. Jessica, he said gently, I need you to understand something. Your mother didn't just tell you I was dead. She told me that she had been killed in a car accident. The ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis. I heard several guests gasp audibly, heard someone's chair scrape against the marble floor as they shifted forward, and heard the soft clink of ice in someone's abandoned drink. But all of that felt distant and muffled because my brain was struggling to process what my father had just said. She told you we were dead? The words came out as barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the room, they carried like a shout. I came home from deployment to an empty house, my father continued, his voice steady but haunted by memories I couldn't imagine. The neighbors said you'd moved away suddenly, that there had been some kind of family emergency. When I tried to track you down through official channels, I was told there had been a fatal car accident in Oregon. Two victims, Sarah Donovan and Jessica Donovan, killed instantly. There were even death certificates. My legs gave out, just completely gave out like someone had cut the strings holding me upright. David caught me before I could hit the floor, his strong arms wrapping around my waist as he guided me to the nearest chair. The beaded bodice of my wedding dress felt like it was made of lead, pressing down on my chest until I could barely draw breath. Death certificates. Fake death certificates with our real names on them while we lived in North Carolina under new identities. How is that even possible? David asked, speaking for the first time since this nightmare had begun. His voice was tight with controlled anger, and I could feel the tension radiating from his body as he knelt beside my chair. How do you fake death certificates? My mother finally moved, stumbling forward with the unsteady gait of someone who'd had too much to drink, except she'd barely touched her champagne all evening. It wasn't like that, she said desperately, her hands reaching toward me before dropping helplessly to her sides. I didn't mean for it to go that far. Richard had connections at the courthouse, and he said it would just be temporary, just until we could figure out a better solution. Temporary? I found my voice again, though it sounded like it was coming from someone else's throat. 25 years is temporary? I kept meaning to fix it. My mother continued, tears streaming down her face now, leaving tracks through her carefully applied makeup. But then years went by, and you were settling into your new life, and I thought maybe it was better this way. You seemed happy. You were doing well in school, you had friends, you were building a life in North Carolina. I was miserable, I said flatly. I cried myself to sleep for 3 years straight because I missed my daddy. I failed seventh grade math because I couldn't concentrate on anything except wondering if you were going to die too and leave me completely alone. I spent every Father's Day locked in my room because seeing other kids with their dads made me feel like someone was ripping my heart out with their bare hands. My father made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach, and when I looked at him, his face was gray with pain. You failed seventh grade math? He asked quietly. You were so good at math when you were little. We used to do multiplication tables while I pushed you on the tire swing. I stopped being good at everything for a while, I admitted, the words coming out harder than I'd expected. Mom had to get me a tutor. And eventually I caught up, but there was this period where I just couldn't make my brain work right. The grief counselor said it was normal for children who'd lost a parent, especially when the loss was sudden and violent. Grief counselor, my father repeated, and there was something dangerous in his tone now. You took my daughter to a grief counselor to help her process my death while I was 3 states away, thinking you were both buried in some cemetery in Oregon. The room was so silent I could hear my own breathing, could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning system, could hear someone's watch ticking from several tables away. 300 people sat frozen like mannequins, witnesses to the complete demolition of everything I'd believed about my life. My new mother in law was crying quietly into her napkin. My college roommates were staring at me with expressions of horror and disbelief. And my cousin Tommy was recording everything on his phone before his mother snatched it away from him. I want to see them, I said suddenly, the words coming out with startling clarity and force. The death certificates. I want to see what my own death certificate looks like. My mother's face went white as fresh snow. Jessica, that's not important now. What's important is that we're all here together, and we can work through this as a family. We're not a family, I said, standing up so abruptly that my chair scraped against the marble floor. Families don't lie to each other for 25 years. Families don't fake death certificates. Families don't steal children from their parents and then act like it was for everyone's good. David stood beside me, his presence solid and reassuring, in a world that had suddenly lost all its moorings. Jessica's right, he said, his voice calm but with steel underneath it. Mrs. Harrison, what you did wasn't protecting your daughter. It was protecting yourself from the consequences of your choices. My mother whirled on him with surprising viciousness. You don't know anything about what I was protecting her from, she snapped. You didn't live with him. You didn't see how he could be when he didn't get his way. What I see, David replied evenly, is a man who spent 25 years looking for his daughter and a woman who spent 25 years lying about why he couldn't find her. What I see is a man who came to his daughter's wedding to tell her the truth and a woman who would have let her daughter live that lie forever if he hadn't shown up. My father pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like hundreds of saved photos. I have pictures of you at every major event, he said to me, his voice thick with emotion. Your 8th grade graduation, your sweet 16 party that I watched from the parking lot, your high school prom where you wore that blue dress with the silver shoes. I was there for all of it, Jessica. I never missed a milestone, even when I had to watch from a distance. The blue dress. I remembered that dress, remembered how excited I'd been to find it at the mall, remembered standing in front of my bedroom mirror, thinking about how I wished my father could see me all dressed up. I'd even asked my mother to take a picture of me to leave at his grave, which now I realized was an empty plot, with a headstone marking the death of someone who was very much alive. You watched my prom, I said, and it wasn't a question because suddenly I was remembering another moment I'd dismissed. Standing outside the country club where our prom was held, waiting for my date to bring the car around. Swing. I'd felt that same sensation of being watched with love and pride. When I'd turned around, I'd seen a man sitting in a dark sedan across the street, just sitting there motionless while other parents bustled around taking pictures and adjusting corsages. You were so beautiful, my father said softly. You looked exactly like your grandmother did when she was young. I wanted to come over and tell you how proud I was, how grown up you looked, how much I loved you, but I was afraid your mother would call the police if she saw me. She would have, I said with sudden, absolute certainty. She would have told them you were stalking us or harassing us or violating some restraining order that probably didn't even exist. My mother's silence was enough. She stood there looking like a woman who'd built a house of cards in a hurricane and was watching it collapse one card at a time. Her elaborate updo was completely undone now, silver hair hanging in limp strands around a face that looked older than I'd ever seen it. The woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me to drive and helped me with homework, and held me when I cried about boys, was a stranger to me now. Worse than a stranger, she was the person who'd stolen my father and then comforted me for the loss she'd created. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had been 25 years in the making. My mother stood there in her pale pink mother of the bride dress, The one we'd spent weeks shopping for together. The one she'd said made her feel elegant and proud to be my mother on my special day. Now it looked like a costume she'd worn to play a role that was finally being stripped away, layer by careful layer, in front of an audience that included everyone who mattered to me. My father scrolled through more photos on his phone, each swipe revealing another stolen moment, another milestone he'd witnessed from the shadows while I believed him to be 6 feet underground. Your college graduation from Duke, he said, turning the screen toward me. The image showed me in my cap and gown, diploma in hand, standing next to the statue in front of the administration building. But what made my breath catch was the timestamp and the angle. This wasn't a photo taken from the audience or from the official photographer's position. This was taken from close range, maybe 15 feet away, by someone who'd been standing right there in the crowd of families celebrating their children's achievements. You were right there, I whispered, staring at the photo that showed not just me, but other graduates and their parents in the background. All of us blissfully unaware that we were being documented by a father who shouldn't have been there, who legally didn't exist in his daughter's life. You were standing right there when they handed me my diploma. Third row back, just to the left of the dean, my father confirmed, his voice heavy with 4 years of college milestones he'd observed from a distance. I was so proud of you for graduating summa cum laude that I nearly forgot myself and cheered out loud. A woman next to me asked if you were my daughter, and I almost said yes before I caught myself. The cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been scanning the audience that day, desperately wishing my father could see me achieve something he would have been proud of, he was there, close enough to touch, forced to pretend he was just another stranger in the crowd. I thought about the speech I'd given as class valedictorian, how I dedicated it to my father who taught me that education was the one thing no one could ever take away from you, even though he couldn't be here to see me use his lesson. He'd heard every word, had probably memorized every syllable, while I'd spoken to an empty space where I thought he should have been. I kept the program from that day, he continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from his wallet. The edges were worn soft from handling, and I could see my name highlighted in yellow marker under the list of graduates receiving highest honors. I've kept programs and newspaper clippings and anything I could find that mentioned you. I have a whole storage unit in Virginia full of boxes documenting your life from a distance. David's hand found mine again, grounding me in the present moment while my mind reeled through decades of rewritten history. A storage unit, I repeated numbly. You have a storage unit full of my life. Your school photos that I bought from the photography companies, copies of your high school newspaper when you made editor, printouts of your college essays that the Duke website featured as examples of excellent writing. My father's voice broke slightly. I bought copies of every book on your required reading lists so I could read what you were reading, so I could feel connected to your education, even though I couldn't help you with your homework anymore. My mother made a strangled sound, something between a sob and a protest. This is exactly what I was trying to protect you from, she said desperately. Can't you see how obsessive this is? How unhealthy. No normal father maintains shrines to their missing children. No normal mother fakes her own death to steal a child from their father, I shot back, my voice rising for the first time since this confrontation had begun. The words echoed off the crystal chandeliers and marble columns, carrying a fury that had been building in my chest for the past hour. No normal mother lets their daughter grieve for a living parent for 25 years while that parent is going slowly insane, wondering if their child is really dead or if they're being lied to. My father's composure cracked further, and I saw him wipe his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so familiar that it triggered another rush of recovered memories. He'd always cried easily at movies and commercials, something my mother had teased him about when I was little. Your daddy's just sensitive, she used to say, as if it was something to be embarrassed about. Now I wondered if she'd use that sensitivity against him later, if she'd convinced herself that a man who cried at Hallmark commercials was somehow too emotional to be trusted with his own daughter. Did you ever try to tell anyone? David asked my father, his lawyer's mind clearly working through the legal implications of what we were hearing. The police, the FBI, missing persons departments? I tried everything, my father replied, his voice steady again but hollow with old defeats. But the death certificates made it impossible. Legally, you were both dead. When I insisted you were alive and living under assumed names, they treated me like a grief stricken veteran having a mental breakdown. I was in and out of therapy for years, being treated for what they called complicated grief and inability to accept loss. One psychiatrist actually suggested I was having delusions brought on by combat PTSD. The systematic nature of it was breathtaking in its cruelty. My mother hadn't just stolen me away. She'd created a paper trail that made my father look mentally unstable if he tried to search for us. She'd weaponized his military service against him, knowing that any claims about fake death certificates and stolen children would be dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized soldier who couldn't accept that his family was gone. How did you finally figure out we were alive? I asked, because I needed to understand how this elaborate deception had finally unraveled. My father pulled out another photograph, this one more recent. It showed me walking across a parking lot in my work clothes, briefcase in hand, completely unaware I was being photographed. I hired a new private investigator 3 years ago, he said. Someone who specialized in cases involving parental kidnapping. She used facial recognition software to search social media and public databases, cross referencing photos with age progression algorithms. This picture was taken outside your law firm in Charlotte. I stared at the image, recognizing the parking garage of Matthews and Associates where I'd worked before moving to David's firm in Raleigh. You've been watching me for 3 years, I said, and I wasn't sure if I felt violated or comforted by the thought. Not watching, my father corrected gently. Confirming. Making sure you were safe and happy before I decided how to approach you. I needed to understand what kind of life you'd build, whether disrupting it would cause you more harm than good. What finally made you decide to come forward? David asked. My father looked directly at me, and I saw something shift in his expression, something that spoke of a decision made after long deliberation. Your engagement announcement in the Charlotte Observer 6 months ago. When I saw that you were getting married, I realized I might never get another chance. I couldn't let you start your married life believing your father was dead when he was alive and wanted nothing more than to walk you down the aisle. The engagement announcement. I remembered posing for that photo with David in my parents' garden, remembered how excited my mother had been to submit it to the paper, remembered how she'd insisted on including my full name and our wedding date. Now I realized she'd essentially published a roadmap for my father to find me, complete with enough details for him to locate the venue and the date. She knew, I said suddenly, the realization hitting me like lightning. When she put our engagement announcement in the paper with all those details, she knew it might lead you to us. She's been waiting for this moment for months. My mother's face confirmed my suspicion before she even spoke. The guilty expression, the lack of surprise when my father had walked into the reception, the way she'd positioned herself near the exit as if she'd been planning an escape route. I thought if enough time had passed, if you were settled and happy, maybe it would be different, she said quietly. Maybe you could handle the truth. Handle the truth? I felt my voice rising again, felt 25 years of misdirected grief crystallizing into pure rage. You mean you thought enough time had passed that I might forgive you for stealing my father and lying about his death for my entire adult life? I thought you might understand that I did what I believed was best for everyone, my mother replied, but her voice lacked conviction now, as if she no longer believed her own justifications. Best for everyone? My father's military training was evident in how he kept his voice level despite the fury I could see building in his eyes. Sarah, our daughter spent her childhood in therapy dealing with abandonment issues because she thought her father had chosen to leave her by dying in a war. She's told me about the nightmares, about the anxiety attacks when I was supposed to come home from deployment and didn't. You made her afraid that everyone she loved would disappear without warning, because that's exactly what I did from her perspective. The weight of unintended consequences was staggering. My fear of abandonment, my tendency to cling too tightly to relationships, my inability to trust that good things would last, my compulsive need to have backup plans for everything important in my life, all of it traced back to a 7-year-old girl whose father had vanished without explanation and whose mother had told her It was because he died serving his country. The ballroom had become a confessional, and I was the unwilling priest hearing secrets that rewrote my entire existence. My bouquet lay forgotten on the table beside me, white roses already beginning to wilt in the warm air, their petals scattered like the remnants of every assumption I'd ever made about my life. The guests had given up any pretense of polite disinterest and were openly staring now. 300 people watching a family implode in real time during what should have been the happiest day of my life. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky but determined, and walked toward my mother. She flinched as I approached, as if expecting me to strike her, but I stopped just close enough to see the mascara tracks on her cheeks, close enough to smell the perfume she'd worn to every important event in my life, close enough to see the woman who'd tucked me in every night while lying to me about the most fundamental fact of my existence. I need you to say it, I told her, my voice quiet but carrying across the silent room. I need you to look me in the eyes and admit what you did. Not justify it, not explain it, not rationalize it, just admit it. My mother's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I faked our deaths and stole you from your father because I was selfish and scared and didn't want to face the consequences of my affair. The admission hung in the air like smoke, visible and toxic and impossible to take back. I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart exactly, but something deeper and more structural, like the foundation of a building giving way. This was the woman who'd held my hand through every nightmare, who'd cheered at every school play, who taught me to drive, and helped me pick out my prom dress, and cried happy tears when David proposed. And she'd done it all while carrying this enormous lie, this devastating secret that poisoned every moment of genuine love between us. 25 years, I said, and the words felt like stones in my mouth. 25 years of bedtime stories about what a hero my father was. 25 years of Memorial Day visits to an empty grave. 25 years of you comforting me when I cried about missing him, knowing exactly where he was, and that he was probably crying about missing me too. My father stepped closer, and I could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne that somehow felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. Jessica, he said softly, I want you to know that she's not wrong about one thing. I did want to control where you went and what you did, but not because I was possessive or abusive. Because I was terrified something would happen to you while I was deployed and I wouldn't be there to protect you. I turned to look at him, this man who was my father, but also a stranger. This person who'd been watching my life unfold from the shadows while I grew up believing he was buried in Arlington Cemetery. Tell me about before, I said. Tell me what I was like when I was little, before she took me away. His face lit up with something that might have been joy, might have been relief, might have been the simple pleasure of being asked to remember instead of being forced to forget. You were obsessed with building things, he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Legos, Lincoln logs, blocks, anything you could stack or connect or engineer into something bigger. You built a fort out of dining room chairs and bed sheets that was so elaborate I had to crawl through it on my hands and knees to reach the kitchen. I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth despite everything, because I could almost remember that fort, could almost feel the satisfaction of creating a secret space that was entirely my own. What else? You insisted on wearing your Halloween costume for 3 weeks after Halloween because you decided you were actually a princess and regular clothes were just what you wore when you were pretending to be a normal little girl. His eyes crinkled at the memory. You made me address you as Princess Jessica for an entire month, and you curtsied every time someone spoke to you. The memory surfaced suddenly and completely like a photograph developing in real time. The purple velvet dress with the silver trim, the plastic tiara that left red marks on my forehead, the way I'd practiced walking in my mother's high heels because I thought that's what princesses did. I remembered the costume, but I'd forgotten the context. Forgotten that my father had been there to witness my royal phase. Forgotten that he'd played along with my elaborate fantasy instead of dismissing it as silly. You remember, he said, and it wasn't a question because he could see the recognition in my eyes. I remember the dress, I admitted. I remember thinking I was too important for regular clothes, but I thought. I paused, trying to reconcile this new information with the story I'd been told. Mom always said you missed Halloween that year because of training exercises. My mother made a sound like she'd been slapped, and when I looked at her, her face was gray with shame. I've been editing him out of your memories for so long that I started believing my own stories, she said quietly. Every time you mentioned something he'd done with you, I found a way to change the story, to make it about me or your grandmother or some imaginary friend. I couldn't stand the idea that you might remember him clearly enough to miss him. The systematic erasure of my father from my own memories was perhaps the cruelest part of what she'd done. Not only had she stolen him from my present and future, but she'd gone back and stolen him from my past as well, rewriting my childhood so thoroughly that I'd begun to doubt my own recollections. How many other memories had she altered or dismissed? How many times had I started to tell a story about my father only to have her gently correct me, insisting I was confused or mixing up my memories? The tire swings, I said suddenly. I remember the tire swing, but you always told me Uncle Bob built it for me when I was 6. I built that swing the weekend before I left for Afghanistan, my father said. We picked out the tree together, and you helped me dig the hole for the concrete foundation. You insisted it had to be high enough that you could see over the neighbor's fence when you swung, so you could wave at Mrs. Chen when she was working in her garden. Mrs. Chen. I hadn't thought about Mrs. Chen in 20 years, but suddenly I could see her clearly. A tiny elderly woman with a wide smile who'd grown the most beautiful roses I'd ever seen. She'd spoken to me in broken English, mixed with what I now realized must have been Mandarin, and she'd always had butterscotch candies in her apron pocket for the little girl next door who loved to swing high enough to see over the fence. We lived next door to Mrs. Chen, I said, another piece of my stolen childhood clicking into place. She had a cat named Emperor who was orange and white, and she taught me how to fold paper cranes. You made hundreds of paper cranes that summer, my father confirmed. You hung them from the ceiling of your bedroom until it looked like a flock of birds had taken up residence. You told me you were making wishes for every soldier in Afghanistan, including me. The paper cranes. The memory hit me like a physical force, so vivid and complete that I had to grip the back of a chair to steady myself. Hundreds of delicate origami birds in every color of paper I could find. Акт зрения отменено с линии рыбалки, которую мой отец помог мне натянуть через потолок моей спальни. I'd been so proud of that installation, so convinced that each crane carried a wish for safety that would somehow reach the soldiers fighting overseas. And when my father deployed, I'd made one special crane out of gold paper and told him it would bring him home safely. The gold crane, I whispered, and saw my father's composure crack completely. You put it in my gear bag the morning I left, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Told me it was the most powerful one because it was made from your best paper, the kind you usually saved for special occasions. I carried it with me through my entire deployment. I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me completely. Standing in our driveway at dawn, still in my pajamas because my father had to leave before the sun came up to catch his transport. The way he'd knelt down to my level, his uniform crisp and official, but his face soft with love and worry. How I'd pressed that golden crane into his hands and made him promise to keep it safe because it would keep him safe too. Do you still have it? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. My father reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, slightly worn golden crane, its edges softened by years of handling, but its form still perfect, still recognizable as the wish I'd folded with 7-year-old hands and a 7-year-old's absolute faith in the power of love to protect the people who mattered most. The ballroom erupted in soft gasps and whispers as 300 wedding guests witnessed this impossible reunion between a father and daughter and the tiny paper talisman that had survived 25 years of separation. David's hand found mine again, his fingers intertwining with mine as if he could anchor me to the present while my past rearranged itself around us. I've carried it through 3 more deployments since then, my father continued. Iraq twice, Syria once. It's been to places and seen things that no child's wish should have to witness, but it's never left my side. When I thought you were dead, it was the only piece of you I had left. My mother was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. I'm sorry, she kept repeating, the words coming out between gasps for air. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go on this long. I never meant to hurt you this much. But you did mean it, I said, turning back to her with a clarity that surprised me. You meant it when you faked our deaths. You meant it when you changed our names. You meant it every time I asked about my father and you told me he was buried in Arlington Cemetery. You meant it every single time you chose to maintain the lie instead of telling me the truth. The difference between intent and impact was becoming crystalline in my mind. Maybe my mother hadn't intended to cause me decades of abandonment issues and grief, but she'd certainly intended to keep me from my father, and the impact was the same regardless of her motivations. She'd made a choice every single day for 25 years to prioritize her comfort over my right to know my father, and no amount of regret could undo the cumulative weight of those daily decisions. I want to see the storage unit, I said suddenly, looking at my father. I want to see everything you've collected, every program and newspaper clipping and photograph. I want to see the life you documented from a distance while I was living it up close. My father's face transformed with something that looked like hope, tempered by caution. It's in Virginia, about 4 hours from here. I could drive you there tomorrow if you want. If David doesn't mind postponing your honeymoon. I looked at my new husband, this man who'd married me thinking he knew my story, who'd promised to love me for better or worse without knowing that my worst included a family drama that belonged in a psychological thriller. David, whatever you need, he said immediately, and I fell in love with him all over again for not hesitating, for not asking me to choose between my newly discovered father and our planned romantic getaway to the mountains. We can postpone the honeymoon as long as you need. This is more important. My father pulled out his phone again and scrolled to a new set of photos. This is what you're asking to see, he said, showing me images of a climate controlled storage unit that looked like a shrine to a missing person. Boxes labeled by year, filing cabinets organized by category, walls covered with photographs and newspaper clippings and programs from every major event in my life. It was overwhelming and heartbreaking and somehow beautiful. This testament to a father's love that had refused to die even when he'd been told his daughter was dead. You've been keeping a record of my entire life, I said, scrolling through the photos, like you were preparing evidence for a court case. I was, my father admitted. Not literally, but I always hoped that someday I'd get the chance to prove to you that I never stopped loving you, never stopped trying to be your father, even when I couldn't be physically present. I wanted to show you that you were never out of my thoughts, never forgotten, never abandoned by choice. The methodical nature of his documentation was both touching and heartbreaking. Box after box of memorabilia from a life he'd observed but couldn't participate in. Photographs taken from distances that spoke of love, constrained by circumstances beyond his control. He'd been the ultimate absent father, not by choice but by deception, maintaining connection through careful observation and meticulous record keeping. What about Christmas and birthdays, mate? I asked, because I needed to understand the full scope of what had been stolen from both of us. I sent gifts every year for the first 5 years, my father said quietly. Mailed them to your old address in Seattle, I'm hoping they'd be forwarded. When I realized they were being returned to sender or simply disappearing, I started donating toys and clothes in your name to children's charities instead. I figured if I couldn't give gifts to my daughter, at least I could give them to someone's daughter who needed them. The generosity embedded in that gesture, the way he'd channeled his frustrated love into helping other children, spoke to the kind of man he was, the kind of father I'd been denied. While I'd been wishing my dead father could see me blow out my birthday candles, he'd been honoring my memory by helping children whose fathers were actually absent. The revelation about the donated gifts hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. While I'd been blowing out birthday candles and making wishes for a father who couldn't answer them, he'd been channeling his love for me into helping other children, turning his pain into purpose in a way that spoke to the kind of man he truly was. The irony was devastating, beautiful, and heartbreaking all at once. Show me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Show me what you donated. My father scrolled through his phone with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd organized his digital life with military precision. He stopped at a folder labeled Donations and opened it to reveal photographs of wrapped presents, receipts from children's charities, and thank you letters from organizations I recognized from their annual fundraising drives in Charlotte. Age 7, I donated a pink bicycle with training wheels to the Salvation Army in your name, he said, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly as he held the phone. Age 8, art supplies and easels to the Children's Hospital because you'd mentioned in that newspaper interview about the school art fair that you wanted to be an artist when you grew up. I remembered that interview, remembered how proud I'd been when the local paper had featured my painting of a sunset over the mountains, remembered telling the reporter about my dreams of becoming a famous artist who painted pictures that made people feel less alone. What I hadn't known was that my father had read that interview from 3 states away and had used it to choose gifts for children who might have artistic dreams like his daughter. Age 9, he continued, a complete set of Nancy Drew books to the local library's literacy program. Because your teacher mentioned in the school newsletter that you'd read every mystery novel in the classroom library twice. Each donation was a love letter written in charity receipts and tax deductions, a father's attempt to maintain connection with a daughter who thought he was dead. He'd been parenting me from a distance, making decisions about gifts based on newspaper clippings and school website mentions, trying to honor the child he'd lost while helping other children who needed what he couldn't give to me. The art supplies, I said suddenly, remembering something that had puzzled me for years. When I was 8, I got really sick with pneumonia right before Christmas and had to spend 3 days in the children's hospital. They had this amazing art room with supplies I'd never seen before, professional grade colored pencils and watercolors and papers and textures I didn't know existed. My father's eyes filled with tears. You used them? I painted a winter landscape while I was recovering, I told him, the memories surfacing with startling clarity. Snow covered mountains with a cabin that had smoke coming from the chimney. The art therapist said it was one of the most peaceful paintings she'd ever seen from a child, and she hung it in the hallway outside the pediatric ward. I know, my father said quietly. I went to see it. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything I thought I understood about the boundaries of possibility. You went to the hospital? I drove 8 hours from Virginia when I found out you were sick, he admitted. I couldn't get information about your condition because I wasn't family according to their records, but I could walk through the public areas of the hospital. I saw your painting hanging in that hallway, and I stood there for 2 hours just staring at it, trying to understand what you'd been thinking when you painted that cabin. The image of my father standing alone in a hospital corridor, studying a painting his supposedly dead daughter had created with art supplies he'd donated without her knowledge was almost too much to process. The layers of connection and separation, of love expressed through impossible circumstances, made my chest tight with emotions I didn't have names for. What did you think I was thinking? I asked, because I needed to know if the man who'd watched my life from a distance had understood the child who'd lived it up close. I thought you were painting home, he said simply. Not the apartment you lived in with your mother, but the home you carried in your heart. The cabin looked exactly like the one we used to drive past every weekend when we went hiking in the Cascades. You always said you wanted to live there someday, in a house where you could see the mountains from every window. He was right. I had been painting home, or at least the idea of home that had lived in my imagination since I was small. That cabin in the mountains had represented everything I'd associated with safety and belonging. And somehow my father had recognized it, even though I'd painted it from memory of a place we'd only ever seen together during our weekend adventures. I still want to live there, I admitted. David and I looked at mountain properties last year, but I could never explain why I needed to be able to see the peaks from the kitchen window. I just knew it was important. David squeezed my hand, and I realized he was learning things about me that I'd never been able to articulate, connections to a past I'd thought was lost forever. We can look again, he said quietly, now that we know why mountains matter to you. My mother had been silent through this exchange, standing frozen near the terrace doors like someone waiting for permission to leave a crime scene. When she finally spoke, her voice was so small I almost didn't hear her. He wasn't supposed to be able to find out about any of that. I made sure the hospital records listed you as Jessica Harrison, not Donovan. I thought we were safe. Safe from what? I demanded, whirling on her with renewed fury. Safe from having a father who loved me enough to drive 8 hours just to see a painting I'd made? Safe from having someone in the world who cared enough to donate art supplies to sick children because his own daughter liked to paint? My mother flinched as if I'd struck her. Safe from him disrupting the life we'd built, she said desperately. Safe from having to explain why we'd left, why we'd changed our names, why we'd been lying for years. You mean safe from facing the consequences of your choices? David interjected, his lawyer's instincts cutting straight to the heart of her motivations. You weren't protecting Jessica from her father. You were protecting yourself from having to account for what you'd done. The truth of that statement settled over the ballroom like a heavy blanket. My mother hadn't been motivated by concern for my well being or fear of my father's supposed controlling nature. She'd been motivated by the same thing that drives most elaborate deceptions: the desperate desire to avoid accountability for choices that couldn't be justified in the light of day. I want to see the letters, I said, turning back to my father. All of them. Every birthday card, every Christmas card, every random Tuesday when you missed me so much you had to write something down. I want to read 25 years of correspondence from a father to a daughter who never got to read his words. My father nodded, reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out a thick envelope that looked like it had been handled many times. I brought some of them with me, he said, in case I got the chance to give them to you. They're not in chronological order, just the ones I thought you might want to read first. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, weighted with decades of undelivered love and words that had been written into the void with no guarantee they'd ever reach their intended recipient. My hands shook as I opened it, and the first thing that fell out was a birthday card with a cartoon princess on the front. The kind of card a father might buy for his 7-year-old daughter's first birthday after she'd been stolen from him. The handwriting inside was careful and deliberate, as if my father had known these words might be the only communication with his daughter he'd ever have. "Happy 8th birthday, Princess Jessica," it read. "I know you can't read this, and I know you probably think I'm not coming back from my deployment, but I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't think about you. I hope your mother is reading you bedtime stories like I used to. I hope you're still building forts out of dining room furniture. I hope you know that your daddy loves you more than all the stars in the sky, just like I used to tell you every night before you went to sleep." The words blurred as tears I'd been holding back for the past 2 hours finally spilled over. This wasn't the handwriting of a controlling or abusive man. This was the handwriting of a heartbroken father who was trying to maintain connection with a child he believed might be dead, pouring his love into words that might never be read but had to be written anyway, because the alternative was letting that love die with no witness. David moved closer to me, reading over my shoulder, and I felt him tense as he processed the depth of loss contained in those carefully chosen words. 300 wedding guests watched in complete silence as I sat in my wedding dress reading birthday cards that were 20 years overdue, each one a time capsule of paternal love that had been preserved in the hope that someday, somehow, they might reach their destination. The second card was for my 9th birthday, and the handwriting was less steady, as if it had been written during a period of particular distress. "I hired another private investigator today," it read. "He says the trail has gone completely cold, that you and your mother have disappeared so completely it's like you never existed. But I know you exist, sweetheart. I know you're out there somewhere, probably wondering why your daddy hasn't come home yet. I'm trying to find you. I will never stop trying to find you." My mother made a sound like a wounded animal, and when I looked up, she was pressed against the terrace doors as if she could disappear through them if she tried hard enough. The weight of what she'd done was finally settling on her. The realization that she hadn't just stolen me from my father, but had stolen my father from me, had let me spend 25 years believing I was unloved and abandoned, when the truth was exactly the opposite. "Keep reading," my father said gently. "There are happier ones." I pulled out a Christmas card dated when I would have been 12, during what I remembered as one of the hardest periods of my adolescence. The front showed a snow covered cabin that looked remarkably similar to the one I'd painted in the hospital years later. Inside, the message was longer, more detailed, as if my father had been saving up conversations he couldn't have and pouring them all into this single card. Merry Christmas, Jessica. I saw your picture in the Riverside Middle School newsletter when they featured their honor roll students. You're so tall now, so grown up, but you still have the same smile you had when you were little, the one that makes your whole face light up like sunshine. I'm proud of you for making the honor roll. I always knew you were smart, but seeing it confirmed in black and white made my heart feel like it might burst. I wonder if you still like snow days. If you still insist on hot chocolate with marshmallows when it's cold outside, if you still make snow angels that look more like crime scene outlines than angels, I hope you're happy, sweetheart. I hope you know that somewhere out there, your daddy is wishing you the merriest Christmas possible. The specificity of the memories embedded in that card hit me like a physical blow. Hot chocolate with marshmallows had been our tradition during Seattle winters, something I'd continued doing in North Carolina without understanding why it felt so important. And the snow angel's comment made me laugh despite everything, because I'd never been able to make a proper snow angel, always ending up with lopsided impressions that looked more like accident scenes than heavenly beings. You remember the snow angels, I said, and it wasn't a question. You were so frustrated that you couldn't make them look like the ones in picture books, my father recalled, his face lighting up with the memory. You'd stomp around the backyard muttering about how snow angels were clearly designed by people who had never actually tried to make one. And I'd have to promise you that yours were the most unique and creative snow angels in the entire neighborhood. Another fragment of my childhood clicked into place. Another memory I'd had but couldn't quite trust because it didn't fit with the narrative my mother had constructed. I'd always remembered being comforted about my imperfect snow angels by someone who'd made me feel like my failures were actually special. But my mother had insisted I was confusing dreams with reality, that I'd probably seen similar encouragement in a movie or television show. What else do you remember? I asked, because I needed to reclaim more of my stolen past, needed to understand which of my supposedly imaginary memories were actually real. My father's eyes took on the distant look of someone accessing a treasure trove of carefully preserved moments. You were obsessed with the idea that every snowflake was unique and you'd catch them on your mittens to examine them before they melted. You insisted we needed to give them names before they disappeared, so we'd stand in the backyard during snowstorms naming snowflakes until our noses were red, and your mother called us in for dinner. The memory surfaced with startling clarity. So vivid, I could almost feel the cold air on my cheeks and the soft weight of snowflakes landing on my outstretched mittens. We'd had elaborate naming ceremonies for snowflakes, treating each one like a distinguished guest who deserved individual recognition before returning to the sky. It had been magical and silly and perfect, exactly the kind of memory a child would treasure forever. Stella and Sparkle and Professor Snowsworth, I said, remembering some of the names we'd given to particularly impressive specimens. And Queen Crystalline, who was the biggest snowflake either of us had ever seen, my father added, and I could hear the joy in his voice at discovering that I remembered our shared game. My mother was crying harder now, watching this reunion of memory and recognition that excluded her completely. She'd been present for these moments originally, but she'd systematically erased them from my conscious memory, replacing them with sanitized versions that didn't include my father. Every time I'd mentioned snowflake naming or snow angel making or any of the other traditions my father and I had shared, she'd found a way to redirect the conversation or convince me I was misremembering. How many memories did you steal from me? I asked her directly, my voice cutting across the ballroom like a blade. How many times did I try to tell you about something I remembered doing with Dad and you convinced me it never happened? My mother's response was barely audible. I thought it would be easier if you forgot him completely. I thought clean breaks healed faster than ragged edges. But it wasn't a clean break, David interjected, his lawyer's mind parsing the psychological implications of what she'd done. You didn't just remove Jessica's father from her life. You gaslit her about her own memories, made her doubt her ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. The term gaslighting hung in the air like an indictment because that's exactly what it had been. Systematic manipulation designed to make me question my own perceptions, to make me dependent on my mother's version of reality because I couldn't trust my own recollections. She hadn't just stolen my father, she'd stolen my confidence in my own mind, my ability to trust my own experiences. I looked back at the stack of cards still in my hands, 25 years of birthday wishes and Christmas greetings, and random expressions of love that had been written in the hope that someday they might reach me. Each card represented not just a missed opportunity for connection, but a piece of my father's heart that he'd offered into the void, trusting that love was worth expressing even when there was no guarantee it would be received. I want to read them all, I said firmly. Every single one. But not here. Not in front of everyone. This is too private, too personal to be witnessed by 300 people who came here to celebrate a wedding, not to watch a family implode. My father nodded understandingly. We can go anywhere you want. My hotel room, your house, the storage unit in Virginia. Whatever feels right to you. The weight of 25 years pressed down on the ballroom like a physical presence, and I realized that this moment wasn't about continuing a public spectacle, but about beginning the private work of rebuilding a relationship that had been murdered by lies and resurrected by truth. The fairy lights that had seemed so magical hours ago now felt harsh and exposing, illuminating truths that were too raw for public consumption. We need to leave, I said, looking around at the 300 faces staring at us with expressions ranging from fascination to horror to pity. All of us. This conversation needs to happen somewhere private. David nodded immediately, his hand steady on my back as he helped me gather the scattered birthday cards and Christmas wishes that had spilled across the table like confetti made of heartbreak. My parents' house, he suggested quietly. They're staying at the hotel tonight. We'd have privacy, and it's only 10 minutes away. My father was carefully folding the golden paper crane back into his breast pocket, treating it like the sacred relic it had become. Whatever Jessica wants, he said simply. I've waited 25 years for this conversation. I can wait another 10 minutes to have it in the right place. My mother stepped forward then, her face streaked with mascara and desperation. Jessica, please, can we talk privately first? Just you and me? There are things you need to understand about why I made the choices I made. The audacity of the request was breathtaking. After 25 years of lies, after letting me grieve a living father and wonder if I was losing my mind when I remembered things that supposedly never happened, she wanted privacy to spin more stories, to control the narrative one last time before I heard my father's unfiltered truth. No, I said, and the word came out harder than I'd intended. You've had 25 years to tell me the truth in private. You've had 25 years to prepare me for this moment, to explain your choices, to give me the chance to know my father before I became a married woman. You chose to lie for every single one of those days, so no, you don't get to control how the truth comes out now. My mother's face crumpled, but I felt no satisfaction in her pain, only a hollow sense of justice finally being served. She'd controlled every aspect of my relationship with my father for my entire conscious life, and now she'd lost that control forever. The truth was out, scattered across a wedding reception like shattered glass, and no amount of private conversation could put it back together in the shape she preferred. David's parents approached us then, his mother's eyes red with tears she'd clearly been trying to hide. Jessica, sweetheart, Mrs. Morrison said gently, you're welcome to use our house for as long as you need. We'll stay at the hotel until you're ready for us to come home. The kindness in her offer, the way she called me sweetheart, like I was already her daughter despite the chaos I'd brought into their son's wedding day, nearly undid me completely. These people had signed up to gain a daughter-in-law, not to host a family crisis that belonged in a therapist's office or a courtroom. Thank you, I managed, my voice thick with emotions I couldn't name. I'm sorry this is how you're meeting my father for the first time. David's father, a quiet man who reminded me of the fictional fathers I'd always wished were real, stepped forward and extended his hand to my father. Sergeant Donovan, he said formally, thank you for your service and welcome to our family. We're sorry it took so long for you to get here. My father shook his hand with the kind of firm grip that spoke of military training and genuine respect. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry this is happening at your son's wedding. If I'd known any other way to reach Jessica without disrupting her special day, I would have taken it. Sometimes disruption is necessary, Mr. Morrison replied quietly. Sometimes the truth can't wait for convenient timing. The exchange between my father and my new father in law felt like a bridge being built over 25 years of absence, a recognition that family comes in many forms, and sometimes the people who should have been there all along need help from the people who were there to fill the gaps. David had grown up with the kind of father I'd always dreamed of having, and now that man was welcoming my father into a family that had already accepted me despite my complicated history. The guests were beginning to disperse, conversations resuming in hushed tones as people processed what they'd witnessed and tried to figure out the appropriate social response to a wedding reception that had turned into a family intervention. My college roommates approached cautiously, offering hugs and promises to call later when I was ready to talk. My cousin Tommy, who'd been recording everything on his phone before his mother confiscated it, gave me a thumbs up and whispered, "That was the most badass thing I've ever seen anyone do." My mother was gathering her purse and coat with the mechanical movements of someone in shock, her carefully planned mother of the bride experience disintegrating around her like sand. "Where will you go?" I asked her, because despite everything, I couldn't completely shut off 25 years of caring about her well being. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "Maybe back to the hotel. Maybe just drive for a while until I figure out how to live with what I've done." "You could come with us," I said, the words surprising me as they came out. "To David's parents' house, if you want to be part of the conversation about how we move forward from here." My father's expression remained neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders at the suggestion. This was the woman who'd stolen his daughter and let him believe she was dead for 3 years, who'd systematically erased him from my memories and made him doubt his own sanity when he'd insisted we were alive. Forgiveness might be possible eventually, but sitting around a kitchen table together discussing the future felt premature. "I think I need some time first," my mother said, and I heard wisdom in that decision. "I need to figure out how to be honest about what I did before I try to be part of fixing it." David was helping me out of my wedding dress when we reached his parents' house, carefully unhooking the dozens of tiny buttons that ran down my back while I stood in their master bathroom staring at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was still wearing my grandmother's altered dress, still had flowers woven into her hair from a ceremony that felt like it had happened in another lifetime. But her eyes were different now. They were my father's eyes, steel blue and determined, and for the first time in my life, I understood where I'd gotten them. "Are you okay?" David asked quietly, his hands gentle on my shoulders as he helped me step out of the dress. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know how to be okay with the fact that my entire childhood was a lie. I don't know how to be okay with the fact that my father has been watching me grow up from a distance while I thought he was dead. I don't know how to be okay with the fact that my mother let me suffer for 25 years rather than face the consequences of her own choices." David hung the dress carefully in his parents' closet, treating it with the same reverence he'd shown when he'd first seen me wearing it earlier that day. "You don't have to be okay with any of it," he said simply. "You just have to decide what you want to do about it now that you know the truth." The truth. It felt like a foreign concept after a lifetime of carefully constructed fiction, but it was mine now, all of it, beautiful and ugly and complicated and real. My father was alive and had never stopped loving me. My mother had sacrificed my well being for her own comfort. I had a storage unit full of documentation proving that someone had been thinking about me every day for 25 years, even when I'd felt completely alone in the world. I changed into jeans and one of David's old college sweatshirts, trading my grandmother's silk and lace for cotton and fleece that felt more appropriate for the kind of conversation that was about to unfold. The transformation from bride to daughter felt symbolic somehow, like I was shedding the role I'd played for the past 6 hours and stepping into one I'd been denied for 25 years. When I came downstairs, my father was sitting at the Morrisons' kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking oddly natural in this domestic setting, despite the surreal circumstances that had brought us here. David had changed too, trading his tuxedo for khakis and a button down shirt, and he was moving around his parents' kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who'd grown up in this house. The normalcy of the scene felt almost absurd, given the magnitude of what we were dealing with, but maybe that's what families did. Maybe they gathered around kitchen tables to sort through the wreckage of their lives over coffee and whatever leftovers happened to be in the refrigerator. I brought the rest of the letters, my father said, gesturing to a leather satchel that sat on the chair beside him. 25 years worth. I wasn't sure you'd want to see them all tonight, but I thought you should have the option. The satchel looked worn and soft, the kind of bag that had seen years of careful use and had been chosen for its durability rather than its appearance. It struck me that this was probably the bag my father had carried to every deployment, every temporary duty assignment, every move from one military base to another. And inside it were letters to a daughter who might be dead, who might be alive, who might never read them, but whose father kept writing them anyway because the alternative was accepting that their relationship was truly over. Before I read them, I said, settling into the chair across from him, I need to understand something. Why didn't you try harder to find us? I mean, I know you hired investigators, and I know the death certificates made things complicated, but you're military. You have access to resources that civilians don't have. Why didn't you use them? My father's expression grew thoughtful, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. I did use them at first. I called in every favor I had, reaching out to everyone I'd ever served with who might have connections to law enforcement or government databases. But when you use military resources to investigate civilian matters without proper authorization, you risk court martial proceedings and the end of your career. David leaned against the kitchen counter, his lawyer's mind clearly processing the legal implications of what my father was describing. So you had to choose between your career and searching for your daughter? Not exactly, my father replied. I had to choose between potentially facing criminal charges for unauthorized use of government resources and finding alternative ways to search that wouldn't compromise my ability to serve or provide for Jessica if I ever found her. A discharged soldier with a criminal record isn't much use to a daughter who might need financial support or college tuition. The strategic thinking behind his choices was both heartbreaking and practical. He'd been playing a long game, preserving his ability to be a provider and protector if the opportunity arose, even when it meant accepting slower progress in his search efforts. It was the kind of decision that spoke to the depth of his commitment, the way he'd prioritized my hypothetical future needs over his immediate emotional gratification. Tell me about the investigators you hired, I said, because I needed to understand the scope of the search that had been conducted without my knowledge. My father opened his phone and scrolled to what appeared to be a meticulously organized file system. I hired my first private investigator in 2001, 6 months after I came home to find you gone. He worked the case for 2 years before the death certificates convinced him that you were actually dead and I was having some kind of psychological break. He showed me a series of emails and reports, professional documents that detailed search efforts across multiple states and databases. The investigator had been thorough, checking school enrollment records, medical databases, social security applications, even contacting relatives and former neighbors to see if anyone had heard from us after our disappearance. The second investigator was more specialized in missing persons cases, my father continued. She was the one who first suggested that the death certificates might be fraudulent, but even she couldn't prove it. The paperwork was too good, too official. Whoever helped your mother create those documents knew what they were doing. Richard, I said quietly. Mom's boss. He had connections at the courthouse, she said. That explains a lot, David interjected. If he had access to official forms and knew the right people to bribe or coerce, creating convincing death certificates wouldn't have been impossible, just expensive and risky. My father nodded grimly. The third investigator I hired specialized in cases involving government document fraud. That was in 2015, when facial recognition technology had advanced enough to search social media and public databases using photographs. She's the one who found the picture of you outside your law firm. I thought about that photograph, about how mundane that day had been, how I'd walked to my car completely unaware that someone was documenting my existence for a father who'd been told I was dead. What did you feel when you saw that picture? My father's composure cracked slightly, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. Relief, he said simply. Pure, overwhelming relief that you were alive and appeared to be healthy and successful. But also anger because it confirmed that I'd been lied to for 14 years about the most important thing in my life. The complexity of emotions he must have experienced was staggering. Joy at discovering I was alive, rage at learning he'd been deceived, grief for all the years that had been stolen, fear about how to approach a daughter who thought he was dead, and underneath it all, the persistent love that had kept him searching when any rational person would have given up. What was your plan? David asked. I mean, you couldn't just show up at her office or her apartment. How are you going to approach her without causing exactly the kind of scene that happened at the wedding? I didn't have a plan at first, my father admitted. I spent months just confirming that you were really alive, that the photograph wasn't some kind of mistake or coincidence. I hired a different investigator to verify your identity, to learn about your life, to understand what kind of person you'd become. He pulled out another folder from his bag, this one containing what looked like a comprehensive dossier on my adult life. Employment records, college transcripts, property records, even copies of legal briefs I'd written for high profile cases. It was thorough and slightly unsettling, like something a stalker might compile, except it had been assembled by a father trying to understand the daughter he'd lost. I know how this looks, my father said, noticing my expression as I flipped through the pages. I know it seems obsessive or invasive, but I needed to understand who you'd become. Before I decided whether contacting you would help or hurt you, I needed to know if you were happy, if you were stable, if learning the truth about your childhood would destroy the life you'd built. And what did you conclude? I asked, because I was genuinely curious about how my life looked from the outside, filtered through the lens of private investigator reports and public records. I concluded that you were strong enough to handle the truth, my father said firmly. Your academic achievements, your professional success, your relationship with David, all of it suggested someone who could process difficult information and make thoughtful decisions about how to respond. I also concluded that you deserved to know the truth before you started a family of your own. The mention of starting a family sent a chill through me because David and I had been talking about having children within the next few years. The idea that I might have passed down my abandonment issues and trust problems to another generation without understanding their source was horrifying. My father had been right to worry about that possibility. The engagement announcement in the newspaper, I said suddenly, that's what finally made you decide to act. It was the deadline I'd been avoiding, my father confirmed. I could rationalize waiting a little longer as long as your life remained relatively stable, but once I knew you were getting married, I realized I was running out of time. If I didn't tell you the truth before your wedding, I might never get another opportunity that felt appropriate. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beyond the Morrisons' quiet neighborhood. I stared at the leather satchel full of letters, 25 years of one sided correspondence that represented the most consistent relationship I'd never known I had. My father had been writing to me longer than some people had been alive, maintaining a connection that existed only in his heart and on paper. Faith made manifest in birthday cards and Christmas wishes that had never found their recipient. I need to read them, I said finally, reaching for the satchel. All of them, starting from the beginning. My father's hand briefly covered mine as I touched the worn leather. Jessica, he said gently, some of them are difficult, especially the ones from the first few years when I was still processing what I thought had happened to you. I wrote some things in grief that I'm not sure you need to carry. I need to carry all of it, I replied firmly. The grief, the anger, the hope, the despair. If you carried it alone for 25 years, the least I can do is help you carry it now that I know it exists. David pulled out a chair beside me, settling in for what we all knew would be a long night. Do you want me to stay? He asked quietly. Or do you need privacy for this? I considered the question seriously. These letters were intimate in a way that few things could be, raw communications between a father and daughter who'd been separated by lies and distance and time. But David was my husband now, the person I'd chosen to share my life with, and that meant sharing the difficult parts as well as the easy ones. Stay, I said, lacing my fingers through his. You're part of this family now, which means you're a part of this story. My father began pulling envelopes from the satchel, organizing them chronologically on the table before us. Some were formal greeting cards, others were handwritten letters on military stationery, still others were postcards from places he'd been deployed. Each one was carefully preserved, stored in protective sleeves like historical documents, which in a way they were. The first envelope was addressed in handwriting that looked younger somehow, less controlled than the writing I'd seen on the later cards. August 15th, 2000, my father said quietly. 3 weeks after I came home and found you gone. I opened it carefully, aware that I was about to read words that had been written during one of the worst periods of my father's life. The letter was longer than the birthday cards I'd already seen, filled with the kind of desperate hope that comes from refusing to accept an unacceptable reality. My dearest Jessica, it began, I know you can't read this yet because you're only 7 and you're probably scared and confused about why Daddy isn't home yet. I want you to know that I'm looking for you and Mommy every single day. I've called every hospital between here and your grandmother's house in Ohio, thinking maybe there was an emergency and you had to leave suddenly. I've driven to all the places we used to go together, hoping I might see our car in a parking lot somewhere. I even went to Chuck E. Cheese because I remembered how much you loved the games there, and I thought maybe Mommy had taken you there to cheer you up while you waited for me to find you. The image of my father searching Chuck E. Cheese for a daughter who was already 3 states away, convinced that I was just temporarily misplaced rather than deliberately hidden, was almost too painful to process. I could see him walking through that loud, chaotic restaurant filled with other people's children, looking for a little girl in pigtails who wasn't there and would never be there. Keep reading, my father encouraged gently, though I could see the pain in his eyes as he watched me process his old desperation. I found your favorite stuffed animal under your bed, the letter continued. Mr. Buttons, the elephant with the purple ears that you've had since you were a baby. I'm keeping him safe for you until you come home. I put him on your pillow every night and tell him the same bedtime stories I used to tell you because I don't want him to be lonely while you're away. I know that probably sounds silly, but I need to believe that you're coming home, and taking care of Mr. Buttons makes me feel like I'm still taking care of you. I remembered Mr. Buttons with startling clarity. He'd been my constant companion, my comfort during thunderstorms and bad dreams, the repository of all my childhood secrets and fears. When we'd moved to North Carolina, my mother had told me that Mr. Buttons had been lost during the move, that sometimes things got misplaced when families had to relocate quickly due to emergencies. You kept him, I said, looking at my father with wonder and heartbreak in equal measure. I still have him, my father confirmed. He's in the storage unit in a place of honor on top of the box containing your baby pictures. I've been waiting 25 years to give him back to you. The idea that my beloved elephant had been waiting for me all this time, carefully preserved by a father who'd refused to give up hope, made my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. Mr. Buttons had been mourned and missed and grieved like everything else I'd thought was lost forever, when in reality he'd been safe and loved, and waiting for a reunion that finally seemed possible. David squeezed my hand as I wiped tears from my cheeks. What else is in the storage unit? He asked, and I could hear the lawyer in him trying to understand the full scope of what had been preserved. My father smiled for the first time since he'd walked into our wedding reception. Everything, he said simply. Your baby blanket, your first shoes, the dress you wore to your kindergarten graduation, every school photo I could get my hands on, copies of every report card and certificate and award. I have your first attempt at writing your name, a Mother's Day card you made when you were 5, even a lock of hair from your first haircut. The completeness of it was overwhelming. He'd maintained not just correspondence, but a shrine, a complete archive of my childhood that had been preserved like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Every milestone, every achievement, every small moment that might have seemed insignificant at the time had been documented and protected by a father who'd understood their value even when he couldn't share them. There's more, my father continued, reaching deeper into the satchel. I wrote to you from every deployment, every temporary duty assignment, every place the Army sent me over the past 25 years. Iraq, Afghanistan, South Korea, Germany. You have postcards from all of them. letters describing what I was seeing and doing and thinking about. He pulled out a bundle of postcards held together with a rubber band, images of foreign cities and military bases, and landscapes I'd never seen. Each one was filled with careful handwriting, descriptions of places and experiences that had been shared with a daughter who wasn't there to receive them. I wanted you to feel like you were traveling with me, my father explained. I wanted you to see the world through my eyes, even if you couldn't be there in person. I described the food I was eating, the people I was meeting, the things I was learning about different cultures. I wanted to give you an education in geography and history and human nature, even from a distance. David was looking through the postcards with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for legal documents. These are incredibly detailed, he observed. It's like a travel journal written specifically for Jessica. That's exactly what they are, my father agreed. I figured that even if I never got to take her on the trips I'd dreamed of, at least I could share the places I went without her. I wanted her to know that her father was out in the world, thinking about her constantly, experiencing things he wished he could show her. The systematic nature of his love was breathtaking. He'd turned every separation into an opportunity for connection, every deployment into a chance to share knowledge and experiences with a daughter who existed in his heart even when she was absent from his life. It was love as a discipline, as a practice, as a commitment that transcended physical presence. I reached for the next chronological letter, dated 6 months later, and found that the handwriting had changed subtly. It was still careful and deliberate, but there was something different about it, something that spoke of hope beginning to transform into grim determination. This is when I started to suspect you might not be coming back, my father said quietly, watching me unfold the letter. This is when I started writing to the woman you might become, instead of just the little girl you were. Dear Jessica, I read aloud from that 6 month letter, my voice steadying as I found my rhythm. If you're reading this, it means I never stopped believing you were alive, and it means I was right to keep looking. The words felt like prophecy fulfilled, like my father had written our reunion into existence through sheer determination and faith. I looked up at him, this man who'd been dead to me for 25 years but had never stopped being my father, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not healing exactly, because healing would take time, but recognition. The recognition that love doesn't die just because someone tells you it should. What happens now? I asked, the question hanging in the air between us like a bridge we'd both have to choose to cross. My father reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, and for the first time in 25 years, I felt completely safe. Now, he said simply, we get to know each other again. We take it slow, we take it careful, and we build something new on the foundation of what never actually died. David stood up and kissed the top of my head. I'll make more coffee, he said quietly. Something tells me we're going to be here all night. As he moved around the kitchen, my father and I sat surrounded by 25 years of unopened letters, ready to bridge the gap between the daughter who'd been stolen and the man who'd never stopped being her father. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise on what would be the first day of our new beginning. The truth had set us free, but the real work was just beginning. If you've ever been betrayed by family or discovered that your whole life was built on lies, share your story in the comments below. Your truth matters, and you're not alone. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories of justice, family secrets, and the power of never giving up on the people you love.